Hi there. In this talk, I'll be trying out on you, assuming you don't mind, a certain way of thinking about the foundations of social ontology. At the current stage, I'm quite open to different ways of thinking about the scope of this, about the framing of it, and about the purposes that it's pitched towards. But today, at least, I'm going to pitch it as a solution to a certain kind of metaphysical puzzle about social facts. Before we start, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge our funder. Thank you, good people of Europe. Okay. A primary task of social ontology is to articulate the metaphysical principles that structure and explain social facts. To borrow an example from Kit Fine, All Souls College is composed in part by its members and in part by its buildings, plus some other stuff. But the location of All Souls College just is the location of its buildings and not that of its members or of any other parts. A social ontologist can explain this by pitching a general principle about how location facts for a certain type of collective entity depend on facts about parts of it. So in this case, the location of a college depends wholly on the location of its buildings. You could call that a metaphysical principle of social reality. And here's a funny thing, such principles are often contingent and seem to depend in some way on our practices, where by practices I mean very broadly stuff that we human beings do, think, say, and bring about. We can easily imagine having a practice of tracking the location of colleges such that their location turns out to depend on the location of their warden, say. So full-fledged metaphysical theories of social reality should really do two things. They should not only propose some principles that structure social facts, but also lay out some mechanisms whereby those metaphysical principles, which could have turned out in various ways, turned out the way that they in fact did. And this is typically done. So Searle has social facts being structured by constitutive rules, as he calls them, and he has those being contingent on facts about collective acceptances in a community. Epstein, for instance, has social facts being structured by grounding principles, and then he has those being contingently anchored, as he calls it, in various ways by further facts. Now, however precisely you choose to characterize this, I take it you do agree that there must be some such mechanisms. I want to raise a very general metaphysical, or rather meta-metaphysical question about them. Somehow or other, it appears that we, through our practices, are putting in place metaphysical principles for social reality. But how can it be, I want to ask, that anything we do has the force of putting in place a metaphysical principle? Metaphysical principles, you might think, just don't seem like the type of entity we have the wherewithal to create. And the suggestion that we can almost has the flavor of a category mistake about it. Now, I think there's something of an underappreciated philosophical puzzle here, and it's been bugging me for a while. Now, maybe you don't find yourself being equally bugged by it. That's okay. I have an ulterior motive in tackling this puzzle. Laying out a solution for it will give me a chance to introduce some tools into social ontology, which I think are intrinsically interesting and probably have some further uses beyond the one I'm proposing here. So you may find that that's where the payoff really is. All right, this is going to take a bit of setting up, so it's only fair I give you the general shape of the answer I'll work towards for orientation. It's a very familiar thought in social ontology, recently helpfully surveyed by Catherine Jenkins in her Ontic Injustice paper, that there is some special connection between the nature of social facts and what we might roughly call constraints on behavior. She herself describes humankind as consisting in what she calls constraints and enablements. Guala and Hendricks, among others, explain social institutions as consisting in equilibria in behavior. Searle thinks that it's distinctive of institutional statuses that they come with deontic powers, as he calls them, attached. And such examples from the literature can be multiplied. I'm going to play on that familiar thought. My suggestion is going to be that if we can work out a clear sense in which the principles of social reality are constituted by constraints on behavior, then we can use that to dissolve the puzzle. For we can further explain, without metaphysical puzzlement, how constraints on behavior could be created by our social practices. And then, by cutting out the middleman, as it were, we can forge a clear theoretical link between our social practices on the one hand and the metaphysical principles of social reality on the other hand. An important tool in what follows is the notion of a hyperplan. A hyperplan is a modeling gizmo, as Seth Yalcin calls it, used to represent distinctively practical kinds of contents. It's useful to compare it to the notion of a possible world. A possible world is a totally specific way of characterizing a way that the world could have been. We commonly use those to model various things of philosophical interest. We can model the content of a sentence or belief, a proposition, as a set of worlds, all of the worlds at which that sentence or belief would be true. We can model an agent's doxastic state, their view of the facts, as a set of possible worlds, all of the worlds that are compatible, that is, not ruled out by, their information. We can model the common ground of a conversation, the sum of what the participants have accepted between them, as a set of worlds, all the worlds that haven't been ruled out by what's been said. Now, a hyperplan is a plan that covers every conceivable circumstance. It is a function from circumstances to sets of options. For any place, time, and situation, no matter how exotic, and for each option an agent has in that circumstance, a hyperplan picks out some of these options as open ones and rules out the others. A hyperplan isn't really a plan in an ordinary sense, for you and I are not capable of formulating, adopting, or following plans of this sort. However, an ordinary plan can be represented by a set of hyperplans, much like a belief about the world could be represented by a set of possible worlds. To be precise, we represent a plan by partitioning the overall set of hyperplans, which you might think of as a counterpart to the overall space of worlds, and removing from it every hyperplan that leaves open options that your plan rules out. What you're then left with is a set of super-specific instructions that represent all the more specific ways of filling out or carrying out your plan. For example, my vague and unspecific plan to buy ice cream tomorrow afternoon is represented by the set of hyperplans, which excludes all hyperplans on which I might do something else with tomorrow afternoon, but leaves in all the others. For instance, plans on which I go and buy chocolate ice cream tomorrow, plans on which I buy vanilla ice cream tomorrow, and so forth. But this is just one instance of what we might model with a set of hyperplans. Hyperplan sets really are a universal formal tool for modeling the content of anything which acts as a requirement on behavior of some sort, be it a norm, a convention, an order, or a piece of advice, etc. All these are represented by partitioning an overall set of hyperplans, by removing from it those hyperplans which represent me as engaging in some course of action incompatible with what the norm or convention or order or advice requires. Okay. The notion of a hyperplan was first introduced by Alan Gibbard, and he was in the first instance interested in using them to model the contents of normative attitudes, and this all in the service of articulating an expressivist, quasi-realist metaethics. But they've since been used by others for other purposes. Specifically, John MacFarlane, in his 2016 paper, Vagueness as Indecision, has applied them to give a theory of gradable adjectives. And it's his proposal, along with Williams's reply to that paper in the same volume, that is the main inspiration for what I want to do in this talk. Now, whereas Gibbard was interested in modeling the contents of an individual's normative attitudes, MacFarlane is interested in modeling the parameters of a conversational context. You may be familiar with Stolniker's notion of the common ground of a conversation. The common ground consists in the things that have been accepted by the parties to a conversation, and it's modeled by a set of worlds. Every time one of the participants makes an assertion and the other participants don't object to it, it gets added to the common ground. This is then modeled by removing from the set of worlds associated with that conversation all of those worlds that are incompatible with what has been asserted. This set of worlds then serves as a parameter of the context for the purposes of understanding the behavior of context-dependent expressions. MacFarlane proposes that we can similarly take a conversation to be associated with a set of hyperplans, and that practical decisions or plans agreed between participants in a conversation can be modeled as the removal from the common ground of those hyperplans that represent courses of action incompatible with what has been decided. Now that's a neat idea in itself, but MacFarlane takes this further. He is interested in the semantics of gradable adjectives, like large. These sorts of terms are notably prone to vagueness. However, MacFarlane notes that we can, between us, narrow down their use on a given occasion. He imagines an employee of an apple sorting plant who is faced with the task of putting all and only the large apples in a certain basket, the one with L on it. Which exactly are the large ones, though? Is this one large or merely on the bigger end of medium? Well, imagine the supervisor comes along, holds up an apple, and says, "This is a large one." Obviously, one could already tell the size, so what this pronouncement does is narrow down, for current practical purposes, where the dividing line between medium and large lies. It lies no higher than the size of this apple. Now, the phrase "for practical purposes" matters here. MacFarlane's picture is that where the meaning of the English word large leaves things vague, we can step in and make plans for how, in a given practical situation, we're going to use the term. Which things precisely are going to be treated as large in that situation. And the plan we choose will then actually help determine the truth value of sentences like "this apple is large" in the context governed by that plan. For example, sorting apples in the apple sorting plant. Very roughly, if the agreed plan says that apples with a diameter greater than this are going to go in the large apple basket, then it will be true to assert in that context of an apple larger than this that it is large. Now, I'm leaving out lots of detail, but that's the basic idea. MacFarlane advertises this as an expressivist semantics for gradable adjectives. What he's getting at by calling it that is, I guess, that this is a theory on which certain descriptive sounding sentences in fact express attitudes, at least in part, of a practical sort, planning attitudes. And their truth isn't just a matter of whether they reflect how things are, but of whether they reflect what we've together decided to do. This is the kind of proposal that I want to make about social facts. I'm not particularly committed to advertising it as a form of expressivism, but maybe I will if people think that the view sounds cool that way. Okay, here's a first move. Instead of focusing on the small scale setting of conversational contexts, I want to focus on the larger scale setting of entire populations that share a common form of social organization, a common social world, if you will. Here's the idea. Populations of people that have to live together and coordinate their behaviors have a variety of ways of creating common constraints on behavior. For instance, they can develop social and legal norms whereby a certain behavior becomes expected and deviations of it are sanctioned. They can develop conventions whereby certain mutually beneficial patterns become entrenched by mutual expectation and reliance. They can develop customs whereby certain behaviors become entrenched through a shared and stable belief in their optimality. They can create various forms of action guiding infrastructure that nudge or force people towards certain behaviors that are deemed desirable, and so on and so forth. There's plausibly a whole host of independent mechanisms whereby populations collectively constrain the behavior of their members. But insofar as these mechanisms create constraints for the same population, we can model their upshot by means of a single set of hyperplans. Whenever the population in some manner enjoins its members to do phi rather than psi in circumstance C, we can model this by removing from the population's hyperplan set those plans which have people doing psi rather than phi. Let's suppose for a population P that we have fixed its associated hyperplan set HP, which represents the sum total of how P constrains the behavior of its members. Now, my suggestion is that we can use this hyperplan set as a sort of semantical metaphysical resource. By performing various kinds of abstraction on it, we can characterize various kinds of social entities that we're interested in. To illustrate, let me focus on social properties. Take some object O, which can be involved in the actions of members of P. This can be anything, a natural feature, an artifact, a group, a person, what have you. Now inspect the hyperplan set HP and extract from it all the constraints on behavior that bear on O. That is, all the constraints on types of actions that might involve O. So if O is a car, that would include constraints on action that involve cars, but also constraints on action that might involve O under some other guise. For example, as an object made of metal, an object located in the street, an object worth more than $1,000, etc. Call this abstraction the treatment of O in HP. Now, having fixed the treatments that HP prescribes for various token objects, we can take things one step further and take classes of objects and then see which sets of constraints on action out of HP are common and particular to the objects in those classes. Unify the objects in those classes, if you will. Or approaching things from the other direction, we could take sets of constraints on action from HP and see which actual and possible objects have in common that they could be involved in the types of action that they constrain. In such ways, we could abstract from the hyperplan set what we might call type treatments, which would characterize more general ways of treating objects, and which by the lights of HP either are or are not accorded to a given object. Okay, now, once we have these, we deploy a further crucial move. We use a treatment to define the satisfaction conditions of a predicate F. We can say that relative to HP, some X is F if and only if X is in the class of objects unified by being accorded treatment T by HP. We might also go a little further than this, for it may be that the class of objects in question is not only unified by being accorded treatment T, but also by having certain more basic properties in common. Intuitively, those properties that make such objects qualify for treatment T by the lights of HP. So let's say that there is some bunch of properties associated with a treatment T in HP and call them C for the condition for treatment T by the lights of HP. Then we could also give satisfaction conditions for F in those terms. Relative to HP, X is F if X meets condition C, or if X is C, treating that as a predicate. Now, this further move of using treatments extracted from the population's hyperplan set to define the satisfaction conditions of predicates, social predicates, is how I'm choosing to articulate the earlier mentioned widely shared intuition that there is some kind of close tie between social facts and constraints on behavior. I am suggesting that social facts are the sorts of facts that can intelligibly consist in constraints on behavior. And more specifically, that some objects having a social property can consist in their existing a prescription to treat that object in a certain distinctive way. To be clear, I'm not asserting that all social properties are like this, but I do want to suggest that a substantial and theoretically important class of them might be. Okay. Now this is enough to enable us to see how the original puzzle should be addressed. Let's say we have a social grounding principle governing some social property f. It says if x is c, then that grounds the fact that x is f. What we want to explain is how a metaphysical principle of this sort could come into force through our practices. Now that we have in view the notion of a treatment of X by the lights of a population hyperplan set HP, it's not so hard to see. For HP instructs the members of P to accord object X treatment T if X is C. And by the type of metaphysical semantics just proposed, X being F just is for X to be accorded T in HP. So we have the following two conditionals. If X is C, then HP accords T to X. And if HP accords T to X, then X is F. The first of these conditionals is simply part of the content of HP. And so there's no particular mystery about how this could come to be true. It's made true by population P engaging in the relevant social processes of imposing constraints on its members. The second conditional is true because the truth of the consequent just consists in the truth of the antecedent. So there's no metaphysical mystery there either. The sense of mystery only arose because the original formulation of the grounding principle cut out the middle man from 2 and 3 by transitivity, as it were. Okay. Now I will conclude. What I've tried to do in this talk is explain how it's possible for us to be creating the principles that govern social reality out of whole cloth by giving you a kind of background theory. Now, in principle, one might propose that this is how we now go and do social ontology by formulating some approximation of a population's hyperplan set and then interpreting social entities by means of abstractions from it. I don't really want to propose as much as that. Though if someone wanted to do it, more power to them. I think that there's not really anything particularly wrong with doing social ontology the way that I characterized it at the start. All this is more meant to shore up those methods and then change them by sort of sketching what backs them up. It should be clear also that I've given you only a rough and partial sketch of this account. For instance, I've only really talked in any detail about characterizing social properties. There's other kinds of social entities that one might want to talk about. So I'm not suggesting that anyone should be convinced by what I've said without having seen some further working out. I do hope, however, that it's enough to be intriguing. So thank you for listening or watching, and I will leave you with some references for works that I've mentioned in this talk, which you can freeze frame if you need more time to read them. All right, thank you.